when I was preparing for this meeting, I was consulting the registry of people who have permits right now, and it is easy to see that there are numbered companies that control other numbered companies and so on and so forth, and you can see that they're registered in Panama and other tax havens. It's quite easy. That information is quite easy to find. Now, you talked about these flaws. Now, obviously, it's not a flaw, it's a chasm. And so, shouldn't foreign shareholders not be allowed on cannabis companies? Because in any case, it's illegal worldwide. So, it's only in Canada that this will be legal. So do you think that by banning foreign shareholders from these companies that produce or distribute cannabis, in addition to vetting, the vetting process, do you think that would help close this chasm? Excellent question, Senator. I think the government wants to get away from the free market because also on the American side, they feel that it's lucrative to invest in Canadian cannabis. I understand, but what we should prohibit is investments where there is a doubt as to where that investment comes from. And we need a Canadian list of tax havens that is effective. The EU has just issued another list of tax havens. Come on, the Cayman Islands, do people actually think that there are a lot of real companies there? Yes, and in any case, it can't be exported. It says so in the law, except for research and other very specific purposes. And given that it's legal everywhere else, well, then the matter of free trade doesn't even come up. So foreign shareholders should not be allowed to participate in these companies. And I think these tax haven aspects, if they were inserted in the law, that would be good. Yes, and if you do so, you might also wish to know that the stock market likes to receive foreign capital. So if you limit foreign shareholding on these companies, you might get some opposition, but I would suggest refusing foreign capital in a targeted way. We have the list of tax havens, they're well known, and even if we used that list, we would have already made a great stride forward. Senator McIntyre, please go ahead. Thank you to both of you for your presentation today. Mr. Bédard, I have a question about the companies that have a permit for medical cannabis versus companies who obtain a permit for the production of recreational cannabis. According to you, companies with medical permits, should those companies be reviewed? Should they be vetted with regard to receiving the permit for recreational? I'm saying that because of what C-45 says about medical and recreational permits. I must tell you that I am wondering a great deal about the issuance of those permits, to whom, why does one person get a permit and another one doesn't? Because there are some people whose applications are received or accepted and others are not. Please go ahead. Professor, do you have any amendments to suggest to the committee? Yes. I have a list. First, people who have already received permits for therapeutic cannabis, they should all be reviewed right down to the final shareholder. If there's a lawyer along the chain, then please vet the lawyer as well, and the lawyer must prove that they have a real client and not dummy administrators. With regard to solutions, the public registry, you must absolutely put one in place. With regard to the people who benefit from the enterprise, in a structure you see a trust, well, you should refuse to issue the permit. Why? I'll tell you, because recently it was brought to my attention that a number of trusts did not comply with the rule of the three certainties, which is to know. The most important one is to know what the purpose is, who benefits from the trust. Now, the language can be fairly broad, but recently I have noticed that a number of trusts in their instruments, the language was so clear that it was impossible to change the beneficiary, so then the product goes back to the person who created the trust. But often, that's the person who has to hide their identity. So in the structure, if you see that there's a trust, well then you should refuse to issue a permit because you are unable to establish clearly that the security clearance is really valid. I would also put in place more rules regarding professionals because we're talking about money laundering, about FinTrack. The accountants have to report back when they have sums from their clients. Accountants don't have to, or rather our clients don't have to report to FinTrack. I think that most of my colleagues, lawyers, are very honest, but unfortunately there are a few exceptions and they do not have to report to FinTrack, so we have to legislate for that. When we're talking about securities, lawyers should have to report for their clients to FinTrack, especially for cannabis, but it should happen. But they should have to report for all sums transacted, especially inbound transactions that come from abroad. They should always be vetted. If you do that, that would already be a step in the right direction. There is no way of verifying on-site from a foreign country the information that we receive. So the Securities Commission in Ontario and the AMF in Canada signed memorandums of understanding to go on site to verify certain information abroad. But all that is vetted are the practices in the industry. So these MOUs have to be strengthened so that on-site confirmations can be done to ensure that a shell company is to ensure that it's not a shell company. You should also stop signing certain agreements with this list of tax havens. I have a lot of respect for the OECD, but it's undergoing a lot of conflict of interest, and they reduced their list. So I think you should take the list with 40 countries from Nobel Prize winner Mr. Stiglitz. Another amendment I'm suggesting is to come back to the essential. The purpose is to remove the proceeds of crime and to conduct prevention. So you need a fund that will be devoted to money generated by cannabis to fund prevention, but also enforcement. If law enforcement agencies don't have the means to investigate, then this will all be doomed to failure. Thank you. Senator Gould, please go ahead. Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to thank both of you for being here today. I have a question/comment for you, Professor, and also a question for Mr. Bédard. You mentioned a number of things, the lack of resources for investigators, and also the problem of tax havens. But we're talking about cannabis in C45. But the problems that you mentioned as well, if I understood your testimony, is that this is a problem throughout all industries, money laundering and so forth. So your recommendations apply not only to the cannabis industry, but to other industry as well. Are these indeed more across the board recommendations to ensure that we vet the sources of money of shareholders? Is that regardless of the industry that we're talking about and not just the cannabis industry? Is that correct? Your concerns are much more broad than just cannabis. Is that correct? You're absolutely right. My concerns are always very broad. However, the objective of C45 is to remove the proceeds of crime from criminals. So if that's the objective, then the means are required to do so. You're right. All of this infiltration is throughout the economy and for all companies that are listed on the stock exchange. But because this is a new industry that is recreational cannabis, then you have to seize the opportunity now to raise the standards and have standards that are worthy of a G7 country. And Mr. Bédard, pardon me. Perhaps this question was already put, and I apologize if I'm repeating myself. Do you have any concrete recommendations for our committee? We're here to study Bill C-45 and to try to improve it. And given your experience, you clearly mentioned that you are absolutely 100% against that bill and this bill, and that is your right. But that being said, do you have any suggestions to improve this bill, to make it more effective in reducing the presence of organized crime, either on the streets, near Berry, for example? Do you have any recommendations? Well, with regard to organized crime, this bill will change absolutely nothing. The legalization of cannabis will change absolutely nothing with regard to street crime. All this bill will do is foster increased cannabis consumption. When you say that you can have 4 plants in your possession or grow them at home, can you imagine how many houses there are in Canada? Do you know that one cannabis plant produces 1 kilogram of marijuana? That's one plant. So if you have 4 plants, that's 4 kilograms of marijuana. So imagine 100,000 houses. Do the math. So do you think that legalizing cannabis, do you think that... Because I think, this term medical cannabis, I think that's just being used to conceal the sale of it, because you can't fight organized crime. So you don't have any recommendations? No. My recommendation is to not adopt this bill. And perhaps it should be completely overhauled, but no, I don't think it should be adopted. Thank you. Inaudible for the interpreter. I would just like to talk about 2 tax-related aspects. First, I think it is a good idea that the RSMP and other police forces who investigate, they need to have access to an automatic access to the security clearance or the files of these people. So there needs to be immediate information exchange as soon as someone requests a permit. And with regard to tax revenues, I referred to that, but I forgot to say that right now the Income Tax Act does not ensure that future capital gains that will be generated by foreign investment will be taxable here. And that needs to be specified in the definition of taxable Canadian assets. So that needs to be subject to taxes here. Thank you for that clarification.